Japanese soldiers were terrified when they found U.S. Marines used machine guns as sniper rifles. At 6:47 on a humid Saipan morning in late June 1944, Japanese snipers stood openly in cave mouths 1,600 yards from the nearest Marine position, lighting cigarettes, stretching their legs, adjusting their scopes with the casual confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. They understood the mathematics of warfare. At that distance, American rifles couldn't reach them. Marine machine guns were for spraying hillsides, not picking off individual soldiers. They were catastrophically wrong. Behind a coral ridge, 26-year-old Corporal Jack Meckfer, an Iowa farm boy with 0 confirmed long-range kills, crouched over an 84-pound Browning M2 heavy machine gun. His commanding officer had positioned the weapon for area suppression, the way every other machine gun crew in the Pacific operated. When McVer had trained on the Browning at Camp Pendleton, instructors told him it was designed to stop trucks and aircraft, not individual men hiding in jungle canopy. The manual listed an effective range of 1,800 yards against vehicles, but everyone knew machine guns were for laying down covering fire in wide arcs, not precision shooting. His crew loaded belt after belt of 50 caliber rounds, each cartridge capable of punching through armor plating, while Japanese observers on distant ridges marked Marine positions through their scopes, completely confident that 1,600 yards of jungle-covered terrain made them immune to anything smaller than artillery. These enemy snipers had held elevated positions for weeks, watching American forces advance below, killing 19 Marines in just the past 48 hours. They moved with arrogant ease, shifting between trees, even standing in cave entrances in broad daylight, because every military manual in the world said machine guns couldn't hit individual targets at that distance. Then McVer did something no Marine manual had ever described. He stopped firing in bursts and started aiming like a rifleman. The morning heat on Saipan felt like breathing through wet canvas. Corporal Jack Meckfer wiped sweat from his eyes as he adjusted the traverse mechanism on his Browning M2. The machine gun sat mounted on its M3 tripod behind a wall of sandbags and coral chunks, its barrel pointed toward the ridgeline 1,600 yards northwest, where Japanese snipers had been picking off Marines for 3 days straight. Meckfer had been manning this position since dawn, watching muzzle flashes wink from cave mouths and tree branches on that distant slope, knowing his crew was supposed to spray suppressive fire across the entire hillside whenever the enemy opened up. That was doctrine. That was what machine gunners did in the Pacific, lay down sheets of lead to keep enemy heads down while riflemen maneuvered. But McVer had been studying those flashes through his field glasses, and he was starting to think doctrine might be dangerously incomplete. Sergeant Thomas Harding crawled up beside the gun emplacement, dragging a fresh belt of 50 caliber ammunition. "Still quiet over there, he muttered, settling into his position as assistant gunner. "Think they're sleeping in?" McIver kept his eye pressed to the optical sight they jury-rigged to the gun's receiver, a 4-power scope salvaged from a damaged sniper rifle. Nothing fancy, but it gave him a clear view of the Japanese positions. "They're moving. Third cave from the left, about 10 minutes ago. Saw someone with a rifle." 1,600 yards, Harding said, consulting the range card he'd sketched on cardboard. "Might as well be on the moon." The conventional wisdom was absolute. Machine guns were area weapons. You pointed them at a general location and pulled the trigger until the barrel glowed red, hoping to suppress whatever was out there. The M2's manual listed its maximum effective range against point targets as 1,800 yards, but that was theoretical. Nobody actually tried to hit individual soldiers at that distance with a machine gun. Rifles were for precision. Machine guns were for volume. But McVer had grown up hunting deer on his father's farm in Iowa, and he understood something about ballistics that the training manuals didn't emphasize. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, faster than any rifle bullet he'd ever fired. At 1,600 yards, it would drop about 8 feet and take roughly 1.75 seconds to reach the target. He'd done the calculations on the back of a cigarette pack, working out wind drift and bullet drop the same way he'd calculated shots on whitetails back home. The difference was whitetails didn't shoot back. A movement caught his attention through the scope. A Japanese soldier emerged from the third cave carrying what looked like an Arisaka rifle with a telescopic sight. The man moved casually, apparently confident that American small arms couldn't reach him across the valley. He settled into a firing position behind a fallen log, his rifle pointing down toward the marine perimeter. McVer felt his pulse quicken. This was the sniper who had killed Corporal Rodriguez 2 days ago and Private Johnson yesterday morning, the same patient, methodical shooter who appeared at irregular intervals, fired 1 or 2 carefully aimed rounds, then vanished back into the caves. The enemy had been using their range advantage to terrorize the entire battalion, knowing Marine rifles couldn't answer back effectively. "Tom," McVer said quietly, "load me a belt with 1 tracer every 5th round." Harding looked puzzled. "We doing suppressive fire?" "No, I'm going to try something." McVer adjusted the gun's elevation, cranking the mechanism to account for the bullet drop he'd calculated. He set the traverse stops to limit his swing, creating a stable firing platform. The M2 weighed 84 pounds without the tripod, and the entire system was designed to absorb recoil from sustained automatic fire. But McVer wasn't planning to fire automatically. Through the scope, he could see the Japanese sniper adjusting his own rifle, preparing to engage targets in the Marine lines. The enemy soldier moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed himself completely safe. 1,600 yards was beyond the effective range of American rifles, beyond the range of most light machine guns. The Japanese manual probably said the same thing their manual said. Machine guns were area weapons, not precision instruments. McVer centered the crosshairs on the enemy sniper's chest, accounting for the wind that was drifting smoke from morning cooking fires toward the east. He took a deep breath, let half of it out, and gently squeezed the trigger. The M2 fired once, a single sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through the scope, McVer watched the tracer round arc through the humid air, its red streak cutting across green jungle canopy. The bullet struck the fallen log 6 inches to the left of the Japanese sniper, sending up a shower of splintered wood. The enemy soldier froze, clearly stunned that a bullet had just passed close enough to feel the shockwave. He looked around frantically, apparently unable to comprehend how American fire had reached him at this distance. After several seconds of confusion, he scrambled backward into the cave mouth, abandoning his rifle position entirely. Harding stared at McVer with something approaching amazement. "Jesus, Mac, you almost got him?" "Almost," McVer agreed, but he was already making mental adjustments. The shot had been close enough to prove the concept. The M2 could reach targets at ranges where the enemy felt safe. It was simply a matter of treating the machine gun like an enormous rifle instead of a traditional area weapon. Word of the shot spread through the Marine positions within an hour. Lieutenant Phillips crawled over from the adjacent platoon, bringing binoculars and a skeptical expression. "I heard you boys are trying to snipe with a 50 cal." "Just testing an idea, sir," Mechver replied. "Seems like it might work." Phillips studied the distant ridgeline through his binoculars. The Japanese positions that had been active all morning were now silent, their occupants apparently rattled by the realization that their sanctuary wasn't as secure as they'd believed. "Range? 1,600 yards, sir. Maybe a bit more to the far caves." Phillips lowered his binoculars and looked at the M2 with new interest. Machine guns weren't supposed to work this way. They were suppression weapons designed to force enemy troops to keep their heads down while friendly infantry maneuvered. But if a machine gun could actually hit individual targets at extended range, if it could turn enemy safe zones into killing fields, then the entire tactical equation might change. As the sun climbed higher and the morning heat became oppressive, the Japanese ridge remained quiet. No muzzle flashes, no casual movement between positions. The enemy snipers, who had terrorized the Marine battalion for days, had gone to ground, suddenly aware that 1,600 yards wasn't the protective barrier they'd assumed. That evening, as Mechver cleaned the M2's barrel and Harding updated their range cards with more precise calculations, both men understood that something fundamental had shifted. They hadn't simply fired a machine gun at long range. They had redefined what a machine gun could do and what safety meant in modern warfare. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. By the third day, the pattern had become sickeningly predictable. Every morning, Japanese snipers would emerge from their cave positions on the distant ridge, 1,400 to 1,800 yards from the Marine perimeter, and methodically hunt American soldiers who had no effective means of fighting back. They would fire, kill, and vanish, operating with the calm precision of men who understood the mathematics of their advantage. Marine rifles could reach out to maybe 800 yards on a good day. Beyond that, American firepower simply ceased to exist. The enemy knew it, and they were using it. Corporal Mechver watched through his field glasses as another body was carried past his position on a stretcher. Private Chen shot through the neck while moving between foxholes, the 19th casualty in 72 hours. Chen had been careful, moving low and fast, but careful didn't matter when the enemy had all the time in the world to line up their shots from positions no Marine could touch. "They're getting bolder," Sergeant Harding muttered, settling beside Mechver's sandbag wall. He pointed toward the ridge complex. "See that? Third cave from the left. Guy stood in the entrance for a full minute yesterday. Just stood there. Smoking." Mechver had seen it. He'd seen a lot of things through those field glasses over the past 3 days. Enemy soldiers moving between positions in broad daylight. Snipers adjusting their scopes without bothering to take cover. Observation teams lounging in cave mouths like they were on a goddamn Sunday picnic. The message was clear. We can see you. We can kill you. And you can't do anything about it. The frustration was eating through the battalion like acid. Marines were warriors, trained to close with the enemy and destroy them. But how do you close with an enemy you can't reach? How do you fight back against bullets that arrive without warning from positions your weapons can't touch? Battalion had tried artillery, but the caves were too deep, too well protected. They'd tried airstrikes, but the jungle canopy made targeting nearly impossible. And pilots couldn't afford to loiter over positions bristling with anti-aircraft fire. They'd tried infiltration patrols, but the terrain was a meat grinder: steep volcanic rock, dense vegetation, and Japanese defensive positions that could see American forces coming from 1,000 yards away. So the snipers kept killing, and the Marines kept dying. Mechver's M2 sat beside him, massive and inert. According to doctrine, it was an area suppression weapon. Pointed at a hillside, pull the trigger, hope the volume of fire made something happen. His orders were clear. If the Japanese opened up, he was to spray the general vicinity of their positions with sustained bursts. Keep their heads down, support the infantry. But Mechver had been watching, calculating. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge had a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. At 1,600 yards, time of flight would be about 1.75 seconds. Bullet drop, roughly 8 feet. Wind drift. He caught himself and shook his head. What was he even thinking? Machine guns didn't work that way. Everyone knew that. But as another Marine screamed somewhere down the line, another sniper hit, another life bleeding out in the saipan heat, Mechver stared at his M2 and asked himself a question that doctrine had never encouraged. What if everyone is wrong? The moment came at 0847 hours on June 25th, when Mechver's patience finally broke. The same Japanese sniper, Mechver was certain it was the same one, had just settled into position behind that fallen log at 1,600 yards. The bastard was getting comfortable, adjusting his Arisaka, preparing to kill another Marine. Mechver could see him clearly through the jury-rigged scope, moving with that same infuriating casualness that said, "You can't touch me here." Mechver's hands moved before his brain fully processed the decision. "Load tracers," he said quietly. "Every 5th round." Harding stared at him. "Mac, we're supposed to wait for the suppression order." "Load them." The belt fed into the M2 with a metallic whisper. Mechver adjusted the elevation mechanism with movements he'd practiced 100 times in his head. 8 feet of drop. Compensate for the eastward wind, account for the 1.75-second flight time. His breathing slowed. His world narrowed to the crosshairs and the target. The Japanese sniper leaned into his rifle. Mechver squeezed the trigger once. The M2 cracked, not the sustained roar of suppressive fire, but a single sharp report that seemed too small for such a massive weapon. The tracer round arced across the morning sky, a red streak that seemed to hang in the humid air forever before it plunged toward the distant ridge. The bullet struck the fallen log 6 inches left of the sniper's shoulder. For a frozen moment, nothing happened. Then the Japanese soldier lurched backward, as if he'd been slapped, his rifle clattering against the log. Mechver could see the man's head whipping back and forth, scanning the jungle. His body language transformed from casual confidence to pure confusion. The enemy sniper scrambled backward, abandoning his carefully prepared position, disappearing into the cave entrance like a rabbit diving for its hole. Harding's voice was barely a whisper. "Holy shit! Mac, I missed. By 6 inches, at 1,600 yards, with a machine gun." Mechver was already cranking the elevation adjustment, his mind racing through corrections. 6 inches left meant he'd undercompensated for wind, Or maybe the tracer chemistry affected the trajectory. Either way, the math worked. The concept worked. The M2 could reach them. The ridge had gone silent. Mikver scanned through his scope, watching the Japanese positions. Nothing moved. No casual cigarette breaks. No soldiers shifting between caves. No snipers settling into firing positions. The entire enemy line had frozen, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how American fire had just reached across a distance that should have been impossible. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Phillips crawled into the position, binoculars in hand and questions on his face. "Corporal, did you just fire at that ridge?" "Yes, sir." "One shot?" "Yes, sir." Phillips raised his binoculars, studying the silent enemy positions. "They've gone to ground. All of them. First time in 3 days that ridge has been quiet for more than 5 minutes. He lowered the glasses and looked at Macfer with an expression somewhere between disbelief and possibility. "Machine guns don't do precision work, Corporal." Macfer met his lieutenant's eyes. "Sir, with respect, maybe they do. We just never tried." Phillips studied the M2, then the distant ridge, then back to Macfer. The silence from the enemy positions spoke louder than any argument could. "Show me," the lieutenant said finally. "Show me it wasn't luck." Over the next 5 days, Macfer transformed his machine gun emplacement into a precision instrument that would have horrified his instructors at Camp Pendleton. Range cards covered every square foot of sandbag wall, hand-drawn diagrams marking distances in 100-yard increments from 1,200 to 1,800 yards. Each prominent landmark on the Japanese ridge had coordinates. Cave Cluster Alpha, 1,450 yards, bearing 320 degrees. Sniper Log, 1,600 yards, bearing 335 degrees. Observation Post Ridge, 1,750 yards, bearing 15 degrees. Harding had copied wind deflection tables from a field artillery manual, translating the data into corrections for 50 caliber trajectories. The M2 itself barely resembled a standard machine gun anymore. They'd reinforced the tripod with additional sandbags, creating a rock-solid platform that eliminated even the slightest tremor. The jury-rigged scope was now permanently mounted and carefully zeroed. Ammunition belts were loaded with specific tracer patterns, one every 4th round, allowing Macfer to observe each shot's impact and make immediate corrections. The hunting had begun. On June 27th, a Japanese machine gun team set up a Type 99 at 1,700 yards, clearly believing themselves beyond American reach. Macfer watched them work through his scope for 20 minutes, learning their rhythm, waiting for the pattern. When the primary gunner leaned left to aim down slope, the same movement he made every time, Macfer was ready. One shot. Center mass. The enemy gun went silent. The efficiency was staggering. Traditional machine gun doctrine called for 400 to 600 rounds per minute during suppressive fire. Macfer was firing single shots or 3-round bursts, consuming maybe 150 rounds per day instead of thousands. But each round mattered. Each round found a target or came close enough to force enemy withdrawal. Lieutenant Phillips integrated the precision fire into his tactical planning, treating Macfer's position like a long-range rifle team rather than a traditional machine gun crew. Cave mouth at 1,400 yards, bearing 075 degrees, Phillips would call out, and Macfer would traverse the gun to designated coordinates. Infantry advances were timed around Macfer's suppression of specific enemy positions. Supply runs moved when the ridge was confirmed clear. The psychological impact rippled across the entire Japanese defensive line. Through binoculars, Marines observed frantic enemy construction efforts, additional camouflage, reinforced positions, desperate attempts to shield themselves from fire that shouldn't exist. Movement patterns changed completely. Soldiers who once strolled between caves now sprinted in panic. Observation posts that had been manned continuously sat empty for hours. Sniper teams that had operated with impunity abandoned their positions entirely. By July 1st, the enemy casualty count stood at 7 confirmed kills and an estimated 15 wounded. The numbers seemed modest until you considered what they represented. MacVer had fired approximately 280 rounds to achieve those results. A 2.5% hit rate might sound poor, but it was astronomical compared to traditional machine gun employment, where tens of thousands of rounds might be expended without hitting a single enemy soldier. More importantly, an entire Japanese battalion had modified its tactical behavior because of one machine gun that refused to follow doctrine. Harding updated the range cards each evening, refining calculations based on the day's engagements. "Getting better," he observed, plotting MacVer's shot groupings. "Yesterday you were averaging 8-inch deviation at 1,600. Today it was closer to 5. MacVer cleaned his barrel with obsessive care. "Still not good enough." "Mac, you're hitting individual soldiers at ranges where they thought they were safe. That's better than good enough." But MacVer was already studying tomorrow's wind predictions, calculating adjustments, planning his shots. The M2 wasn't just a machine gun anymore. It was a precision instrument, and the enemy was learning to fear it. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to World War II Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. The bullet cracked past MacVer's head at 0630 hours on July 2nd. So close, he felt the pressure wave against his cheek. He dropped flat behind the sandbags as a second round punched into the coral parapet 2 inches from where his shoulder had been. The shots had come from 1,400 yards northwest, well within the effective range of a skilled marksman with a scoped Arisaka. "They've got us ranged," Harding hissed, crawling backward toward the communication trench. "That's not random fire, Mac." MacVer's stomach twisted with a realization he should have anticipated days ago. By maintaining a fixed firing position for over a week, he'd given the enemy everything they needed: time to study his location, calculate his coordinates, and assign counter-snipers to eliminate the threat. The hunter had become the hunted. The immediate problem was tactical nightmare. They'd spent days perfecting range cards and sight settings for this exact position. Moving the 84-pound M2 and its tripod to an alternate location meant starting over. An hour of setup time during which the Japanese ridge would be free to operate without harassment. But staying meant accepting sniper fire that would eventually find its mark. A third bullet struck the sandbags, sending up a spray of coral dust. "We need to move," Harding said. "We need them to think we're still here," MacVer countered. They spent the next 3 hours constructing a decoy position 50 yards east. Spare sandbags, camouflage netting, a damaged M2 barrel, and a helmet positioned to simulate a gunner's head. The work had to be done on hands and knees, crawling to avoid skylining against the ridge. Every movement invited a bullet. The real M2 was relocated to a depression that provided natural protection from the northwest while maintaining clear fields of fire. McVer's hands shook as he recalculated range data from the new position. Everything had changed. Angles, distances, wind patterns. A week of careful preparation rendered useless in 3 hours. On July 4th, the decoy proved its worth. A Japanese sniper fired 3 rapid shots at the dummy emplacement, bullets striking sandbags and netting with audible impacts. McVer located the muzzle flash through his scope, a cluster of boulders at 1,500 yards, and returned fire. His shot struck inches from the target, sending up rock fragments that forced the enemy sniper to abandon his position. But the engagement revealed a fundamental problem. Traditional machine gun crews could suppress enemy fire through volume, forcing opposing forces to keep their heads down. McVer's precision approach required him to expose his position for extended periods while aiming, making him vulnerable to the very counter-sniper tactics he'd pioneered. The psychological pressure was suffocating. He'd spent 2 weeks establishing dominance, creating a zone where Japanese forces feared to move. Now that dominance was slipping away, enemy mortars began dropping rounds near his position, not accurate enough to score direct hits, but close enough to force constant relocation. Each move meant recalibrating everything. Each shot meant exposing himself to counter-fire. The relaxed, methodical shooting of the previous week was replaced by a tense game where both sides possessed lethal capability, and one moment's carelessness could prove fatal. Harding watched McVer check the scope mounting for the 5th time that hour. "You okay, Mac?" McVer didn't answer immediately. Through his scope, he could see Japanese soldiers moving more boldly now, sensing weakness. The enemy was adapting, learning, fighting back. "Yeah," he finally said, "just realizing we taught them how to hunt us, too." The crisis arrived at dawn on July 8th, carried by a supply sergeant with apologetic eyes and empty hands. "No resupply, he told McVer. "Kamikazes hit the supply ships yesterday. Battalion's rationing what we've got left." McVer counted his remaining 50 caliber rounds. 43 cartridges, less than 1 complete belt. At his current rate of engagement, maybe 6 shots before the M2 went silent. Harding crouched beside him, studying their ammunition inventory with growing dread. "We've been suppressing 2 miles of ridgeline. What happens when they figure out we're done?" Through his field glasses, McVer could already see the answer. Japanese soldiers were moving more boldly than they had in days, testing, probing, sensing the shift. An enemy machine gun team was setting up at 1,600 yards, working with the deliberate confidence of men who believed American long-range fire had ended. Every instinct screamed at McVer to engage. That machine gun would command the main supply route, cutting off ammunition and medical supplies to the forward companies. 1 shot, maybe 3, and the threat would be eliminated. 3 rounds, 7% of his remaining capability. "Mac?" Harding's voice carried the weight of the decision. McVer settled behind his M2, adjusted for range and wind, and squeezed the trigger once. The 50 caliber round struck the Japanese gunner's center mass, throwing him backward into his crew. The survivors scrambled for cover, abandoning their weapon. 38 rounds remaining. The morning stretched into afternoon torture. Japanese forces probed the marine perimeter with small unit attacks, coordinated, systematic movements designed to identify weak points in the American line. Enemy squads advanced to positions just beyond rifle range, established firing positions, engaged Marine outposts, then withdrew. Traditional doctrine demanded suppressive fire. Volume, area coverage, force them back. Macver watched through his scope, his finger resting beside the trigger, watching enemy soldiers operate at ranges where his weapon could reach them. Each squad represented maybe 20 rounds to suppress effectively. He had 38 total. "We can't just let them," Harding started. "We have to." Macver cut him off. The words tasted like ash. At 1540 hours, the calculus changed. A Japanese sniper team established a position at 1,400 yards and began systematically engaging Marine forward observers. Macver watched through his scope as the enemy marksman killed one spotter, wounded another. High-value targets, exactly the kind of threat that justified expenditure of scarce ammunition. 2 shots. The second forced the snipers to abandon their position. 36 rounds. The psychological pressure was crushing. Macver had spent 2 weeks establishing fire superiority that extended far beyond normal small arms range. Japanese forces had modified their entire tactical approach in response, restricting movement, abandoning positions, operating in fear. Now that dominance was bleeding away, one precious cartridge at a time. By evening, Harding suggested a desperate solution. "What if we pool ammunition with the other M2 crews? Coordinate fire, share resources." Lieutenant Phillips approved within the hour. 3 heavy weapons crews consolidated their remaining 50 caliber rounds, 112 cartridges total. The ammunition was distributed based on crew capability. Macver's team received 45 rounds as the most experienced precision shooters. It wasn't enough, not for sustained operations, not for the way they'd been fighting, but it was enough for what was coming. Through his scope, Macver watched Japanese forces massing in the distant tree lines. Too many soldiers moving with too much purpose. Mortars were being positioned, machine guns emplaced. The enemy wasn't probing anymore. They were preparing for a counterattack, and Macver had 45 chances to stop them. The Japanese counterattack began at 2130 hours with mortar fire that turned the night sky orange and filled the air with screaming metal. Macver crouched behind his M2, watching enemy infantry emerge from the ridgeline in coordinated waves. They moved with unusual boldness, 50, maybe 60 soldiers advancing down the slope toward the Marine perimeter. Behind them, machine gun teams were establishing positions at ranges that had been suicidal just days ago. The enemy had sensed American weakness and was exploiting it. "Multiple targets," Harding called out, scanning through field glasses. "Machine gun at 1,400 yards, bearing 320 degrees. Sniper team at 1,550, bearing 005 degrees. Mortar team setting up at—" "I see them." Macver's voice was calm, but his mind was racing through calculations. 45 rounds. Multiple crews now coordinated through radio. Every shot had to count not just tactically, but strategically. Lieutenant Phillips' voice crackled over the radio net. "All Bulldog units, weapons free. Precision crews prioritize crew-served weapons. Break their support structure." Macver centered his crosshairs on the Japanese machine gun team at 1,400 yards. The gunners were working frantically to get their weapon operational, knowing they had minutes before American artillery could range them. They didn't know they had seconds. 1 shot. The primary gunner collapsed. 1,400 yards to the east, another M2 crew engaged a mortar team. Single shot. The mortar tube went silent. The Japanese advance faltered. Enemy soldiers who'd been moving with confidence suddenly realized that their supporting weapons were being systematically eliminated by fire that shouldn't exist. The psychological impact was immediate. Troops dove for cover, officers shouted confused orders, the coordinated assault began fragmenting into chaos. "Sniper team, 1,550 yards," McVer said quietly, already adjusting his aim. Through his scope, he could see the enemy marksman trying to identify the source of the devastating fire. One shot. Close enough. They scattered. The radio net came alive with coordinated fire missions. Bulldog 3, target at 1,600, bearing 045 degrees. Bulldog 1, I've got the machine gun at 1,250. Three M2 crews were now functioning as a single precision fire unit, sharing intelligence, dividing targets, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. The innovation that had started with one farm boy questioning doctrine had scaled into a coordinated tactical system. A Japanese officer tried to rally his troops at 1,700 yards, standing exposed, waving his sword. McVer hesitated. The range was extreme, the target small, the shot difficult. 2 rounds to be certain, maybe 3. He fired once. The officer went down. The enemy advance broke entirely. By midnight, the Japanese counterattack had collapsed into a full retreat. Enemy forces were streaming back toward the ridgeline, abandoning equipment, dragging wounded, their offensive shattered, not by artillery or airstrikes, but by precision machine gun fire that had turned their supposed safe zones into killing fields. McVer counted his remaining ammunition. 17 rounds left from his allocation. The other precision crews reported similar expenditure, 28 rounds total across 3 positions to break an entire battalion-level assault. Harding stared at the distant ridge, where Japanese forces were digging in deeper, more desperate. 28 rounds, Mac. We stopped them with 28 rounds. We stopped them because they couldn't understand how. McVer replied quietly. Fear multiplies. The innovation had worked, but barely, and only because scarcity had forced a level of coordination that abundance never would have demanded. Sometimes limitation breeds perfection. The white flags appeared on July 12th, not surrender flags exactly, but markers requesting permission to retrieve their dead. The Japanese ridge had gone silent 3 days earlier, its defensive positions abandoned during the night. McVer watched through his scope as enemy medics moved cautiously across terrain where they'd once operated with impunity, their body language transformed from arrogance to wariness. He didn't fire. None of the precision crews did. Lieutenant Phillips arrived that afternoon with 2 men from Division Intelligence and a stack of captured Japanese documents. Their battalion commander referenced devil guns in his reports, Phillips explained, spreading papers across the sandbags. Estimated American casualties they inflicted at 3 times actual numbers. Attributed losses to artillery and airstrikes rather than admit machine gun fire reached them. McVer studied the documents without satisfaction. 7 confirmed kills, maybe 15 wounded, against 19 Marine casualties over the same period, a tactical exchange that barely qualified as favorable. It's not about the numbers, Phillips continued, as if reading his thoughts. They changed how they fought, restricted movement, abandoned positions, spent resources on defenses against a threat that consumed 28 rounds. That's the real math. By evening, a Marine Corps observer team had arrived to document McVer's modifications, the reinforced tripod, the improvised scope mounting, the range cards that covered every square foot of sandbag wall. They measured angles, photographed positions, interviewed both McVer and Harding with the methodical thoroughness of men who understood they were witnessing doctrine being rewritten in real time. "This will be in the manual by September," one observer promised. "Every heavy weapons company will train on precision engagement techniques." McVer nodded, but felt hollow. The manual would describe the mechanics, elevation adjustments, wind calculations, tracer patterns. It couldn't capture the weight of rationing 45 rounds across an entire night. It couldn't explain the psychological warfare of forcing an enemy to fear what shouldn't reach them. That night, McVer disassembled his M2 for the final time on Saipan. He removed the jury-rigged scope, restored the standard sight, returned the weapon to its doctrine-approved configuration. Harding watched in silence as McVer packed away the range cards, the wind tables, the carefully documented shot logs. "Feels wrong," Harding finally said, "like we're erasing what we learned." "We're not erasing it." McVer ran a cleaning rod through the barrel with practiced efficiency. "We're just remembering that innovation serves necessity. War demanded something different. We provided it. Now the war moves on." The M2 sat gleaming in the moonlight. 84 pounds of steel and precision engineering returned to its intended form. Tomorrow it would provide area suppression for an advance on Mount Tapochau. Volume fire, doctrine, standard employment. But somewhere in the manual being written, in the training that would follow, in the minds of machine gunners who would face their own impossible ranges, the lesson would persist. Sometimes the weapon doesn't define the mission. Sometimes necessity redefines the weapon. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't measured in bodies, but in forcing your enemy to fight afraid. Don't just watch. Subscribe. Help World War II Archives Declassified. Hit 1,000 subscribers.